the warming footprint since 1990. So this is just looking at how, that's the UK as a whole on the left and UK agriculture on the right. And we're just looking now at temperature changes since 1990 caused by emissions in the sector. You'll see that throughout the period since 1990, nitrous oxide has continued to drive temperatures upwards, but methane drove temperatures upwards to start with, while methane emissions were still, they'd recently risen. But since 2000 or so, the methane curve, that's the solid blue one, has turned around and is heading downwards again. And so when you add them all up, you see that there's actually very small additional warming since 2000, indicated by that little arrow, despite the fact that nominally agriculture has contributed substantial amounts to UK's total emissions. It's actually not caused very much additional warming over the past couple of decades. That said, of course, there is in principle an opportunity for agriculture to contribute much more. And this is something which you may hear about when you're talking to officials in DEFRA and so on. They like to talk about marginal warming, which means the warming that your sector causes against the alternative situation that your sector ceased to exist. Although I think it's always important to stress, so this is a purely hypothetical, the dotted line here shows a purely hypothetical scenario in which UK agriculture ceased to exist in 2000. And by the way, also the UK stopped eating in 2000 as well, because of course, it doesn't make any difference to global temperature if we shut down UK agriculture and then just import all our food from overseas. I mean, the impact on global temperature is identical. In fact, arguably, depending on where we get the food from, it might well be worse. So when you talk about agriculture's contribution to warming, you want to be careful that you bear that in mind. So perhaps I think this phrase of marginal warming is a bit confusing, and it's a bit of a confusing idea. I think it's better to distinguish between the additional warming that a sector is causing. This is the small amount of warming that your emissions in total may be causing, and it may even be negative if your emissions are sufficiently are coming down fast enough. And then compare that to what we might call the maintained warming since 2000, which is the warming that you're propping up global temperatures by existing. And I think that's, we can have a conversation about responsibilities and so on here, but that's clearly something very different from causing additional warming just through your existence, maintaining global temperatures the way they are. So this is understanding these things. So your additional warming is what you as a sector cause in terms of an increase in temperature over a period due to the combination of your ongoing emissions, new sources, and past emissions. The maintained warming is the prevented cooling, if you like, due to ongoing emissions. And if you add these two up, you get this marginal warming. So I'm mentioning this, and this may be sort of getting slightly into the weeds here, but when you take this forward and raise this with DEFRA officials or environmentalists, for example, I guarantee you they'll start jumping up and down and saying you've got to take responsibility for your marginal warming. And we'll talk about that, the policy implications of this now, because this is where it gets, I think, quite interesting. So at the moment, we frame climate policy in terms of, as it were, emissions inputs measured with this standard accounting framework. So using this sort of input-based accounting, if you're a crop farmer and you reconvert your land to forestry and thereby absorb carbon from the atmosphere as your trees grow, then under most people's carbon accounting frameworks, you'd be rewarded for doing so, because you'd be able to sell carbon credits to an airline, perhaps, or you'd be able to take credit under the ELMS system, the ELMS system, if they ever get that finalized, for taking carbon back out of the atmosphere. And that's all makes a lot of sense, because you would be contributing to reducing global temperatures. So, the way we do the accounting for crop farmers converting to forestry is straightforward, because it only really affects carbon dioxide. We don't have to worry about different. I mean, it might have nitrous oxide emissions might be a part of it too, in terms of when the crops are growing, but let's leave that out of it for now, just for simplicity. And we can see that there, it's a pretty straightforward calculation to work out, okay, how much carbon are you taking up, and then convert that into your impact on global temperature. What's interesting is that a livestock farmer who does exactly the same thing as far as global temperature is concerned, by reducing her methane emissions, for example, by using feed additives or feeding or vaccines, or even by reducing their herd size, they would simply be told that they were emitting less or causing less climate harm, but they wouldn't be rewarded for reducing global temperatures under conventional ways of emissions accounting, even though they're actually having exactly the same impact on global temperatures, past, present, and future, in these two farms. So this is, this doesn't make sense to me. And I think it's relatively easy to fix. If we're pursuing a temperature goal, which we want to stop global warming, we need to penalize actions that contribute to increasing global temperature. We need to reward actions that contribute to reducing global temperature. And of course, we also need to ensure that any reductions in global temperature are permanent. So if a crop farmer plants a forest, it's no good if they burn down or cut down their forest in 20 years' time and stick all that carbon back up in the atmosphere. Likewise, if a livestock farmer reduces their herd size and does exactly the same thing to global temperature as the crop farmer planting a forest, it's no good if they just increase it again in a few years' time, thereby driving global temperatures back up again. So it's very important that we reduce global temperature and that we ensure that any reductions we make are permanent. The frustration I have with this is that, I thought, full disclosure, I wasn't a fan of leaving the EU, but we did. And one of the things that was a result of leaving the EU is we left the Common Agricultural Policy, which gave us an opportunity in the UK to innovate in this space. And one of the things we could do, but DEFRA shows no inclination to, is to reward farmers according to their impact on global temperature. And crucially, this would give a very different incentive system for livestock farmers than our current approach. But what we find is that there seems to be very significant inertia behind the sort of conventional carbon footprinting. Everybody insists that we keep doing it because everybody else is doing it. It sort of seems to be a self-sustaining argument. But I would suggest that one thing which we could argue for, and would be a pretty easy win, would be for DEFRA, and indeed the UK government in our submissions to the UNFCCC, the United Nations system for managing climate change, we could report the warming impact of our emissions, or equivalently, we could report warming equivalent emissions, as well as our aggregate CO2 equivalent emissions. So this is just extra information. Here's our emissions using the conventional accounting system, and here's the warming they're causing. And that's something that I think the farmers of the UK should be arguing for. Just to reiterate, we need your help. We collectively, I'm not a farmer, but I know that I want to stop climate change, and I know that we need farmers' help to do it. But I feel strongly we shouldn't be trying to secure your help through an accident of poor accounting. If we're asking you to compensate for warming caused by other sectors because other sectors like transport are doing a bad job of reducing their emissions, then I think we should be paying you for the service. And that's why I think we need an open and transparent discussion about how, when, and why to reduce emissions, which reflects their impact on global temperature. And that's why I'm always very keen to talk to farmers to stress this isn't very complicated. And at the moment, you're being saddled with a system which I think, if it had been designed by farmers, would be very different. And I'm hoping that's at least triggered some questions from you. Thank you.